He thought buying the entire ghost town of Millbrook, Nevada for $37,000 was the deal of a lifetime. Marcus Holloway had made his fortune in tech, but after his divorce, he craved something different. Something isolated. Something that was entirely his. The real estate listing showed weathered buildings, empty streets, and a population of 0. What it didn't mention were the 5 women who had never left. Elena Vega stood in the doorway of what used to be the general store, her dark hair catching the desert wind. She was perhaps 40, with eyes that held secrets deeper than the abandoned mine shafts that dotted the surrounding hills. Behind her, 4 other women emerged from the shadows of buildings that should have been empty. Sarah Chan, a delicate woman in her 30s with paint-stained fingers. Margaret O'Sullivan, a redhead whose Irish accent still colored her words after 20 years in America. Rosa Martinez, whose weathered hands spoke of hard work and harder choices. And finally, Diane Kruger, blonde and sharp-eyed, who carried herself like someone accustomed to being in charge. Marcus climbed out of his Tesla, dust swirling around his designer boots. He'd expected emptiness, silence, maybe some wildlife. He hadn't expected 5 women staring at him like he was either their salvation or their doom. Elena stepped forward first, her voice carrying across the empty street like a whisper that demanded attention. She told him something that made his blood run cold. Something about the town's last mayor. Something about debts that went deeper than money. Something about why they couldn't leave even if they wanted to. But first, she said, they needed to see if he was worthy of their trust. The way she said it, with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, made Marcus realize that his simple real estate purchase had just become something far more complicated. The 5 widows had lived in Millbrook for reasons they kept as closely guarded as the secrets buried beneath the town's dusty streets. Elena had lost her husband in the mine collapse of 2019, the same accident that had claimed 3 other men and left the town's economy in ruins. Sarah had arrived 2 years later, fleeing something in California that she never talked about. Margaret had been there the longest, having moved from Boston after her husband's sudden death 15 years ago. Rosa's story involved a fire in Phoenix and insurance money that had run out long ago. Diane had come from Chicago with plans to write a book about ghost towns, but had stayed for reasons she kept to herself. They had formed an unlikely family, these 5 women, bound together by loss and circumstance. They shared resources, shared secrets, and shared a terrible knowledge about what lay beneath Millbrook's surface. The town's previous owner, Mayor Henderson, had died 3 months ago under circumstances that the county sheriff had ruled a heart attack, but the women knew differently. Henderson had discovered something in his final days, something that had made him desperate to sell the town quickly and quietly. He had approached each of the women with an offer that was part threat, part plea. He wanted them gone before the new owner arrived. But they had nowhere to go, and besides, they had become the guardians of something that couldn't be left unprotected. Marcus Holloway was about to learn that some purchases come with responsibilities that extend far beyond property taxes and maintenance. As Elena led him toward the old mayor's office, her words carried the weight of a confession that would change everything he thought he knew about his new acquisition. The mayor's office smelled of old paper and secrets. Elena moved behind Henderson's desk like she belonged there, pulling out a leather-bound ledger that looked older than the town itself. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, and Marcus saw names, dates, and numbers that made no immediate sense. Sarah stood by the window, her artist's eye cataloging every change in Marcus's expression. Margaret positioned herself by the door, her Irish stubbornness evident in her crossed arms and steady gaze. Rosa remained silent but watchful, while Diane took notes in a shorthand that suggested she was recording everything for reasons of her own. Elena explained that Millbrook had been built on land that the government had wanted to remain forgotten. The mine hadn't been searching for gold or silver, but for something that the military had lost during weapons testing in the 1960s. Henderson had stumbled across documents that revealed the true nature of what lay beneath the town, and it had killed him. Not the knowledge itself, but the people who wanted that knowledge to stay buried. The women had found Henderson's body and the open safe that had contained these documents. They had also found evidence that someone had been watching the town, waiting for the right moment to retrieve what the mine had disturbed decades ago. Marcus felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as Elena continued her explanation. The women weren't just residents who had refused to leave. They were witnesses to something that powerful people wanted to remain secret, and now he was a witness too. The question was whether he would become their ally or another casualty of Millbrook's buried truth. The first indication that they were being watched came that night. Marcus had set up camp in what used to be the hotel, a two-story building with most of its windows still intact. Elena had given him blankets and a kerosene lamp, apologizing for the lack of electricity. The power had been cut 3 months ago, shortly after Henderson's death. As he prepared for his first night in his new town, Marcus noticed movement in the tree line beyond the main street. Dark shapes that didn't move like wildlife, too purposeful and too interested in the buildings below. He mentioned it to Elena when she brought him coffee the next morning, coffee that tasted like it had been made over a campfire. She nodded grimly and led him to an upstairs window in the general store. Through binoculars that had seen better days, Marcus could see the glint of metal in the hills, the kind of reflection that came from high-end surveillance equipment. Elena told him they had been watching the Watchers for months now, learning their patterns, understanding their technology. The Watchers came in shifts, always maintaining visual contact with the town but never approaching directly. They were waiting for something or someone. Sarah joined them at the window, pointing out the specific locations where they had identified listening devices and motion sensors. The town was surrounded by a network of surveillance that would make the NSA proud. Margaret appeared with a pot of stew that smelled better than anything Marcus had eaten in months, explaining that they had learned to live off the grid through necessity rather than choice. Rosa showed him the garden they maintained behind the old church, hidden from overhead observation by carefully placed tarps. Diane revealed the radio equipment they used to monitor communications, picking up fragments of conversation that painted a picture of organization and patience. The truth about what lay beneath Millbrook began to reveal itself on Marcus's third day in town. Elena led him to the mine entrance, a gaping wound in the hillside that had been hastily sealed with concrete and warning signs. The official story was that the mine had been closed due to structural instability, but Elena showed him photos that Henderson had hidden in his safe. The photos revealed a chamber deep in the mine, carved with symbols that didn't match any known indigenous culture. In the center of the chamber sat an object that looked like it had been crafted by technology far more advanced than anything from the 1960s. Henderson's notes suggested that the object had been discovered by military personnel during weapons testing and had been deliberately buried in the mine to keep it away from public knowledge. The problem was that the object seemed to be active in some way, generating readings on equipment that Henderson had borrowed from a geology professor in Las Vegas. Sarah pulled out sketches she had made based on Henderson's descriptions, drawings that showed intricate patterns and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Margaret contributed her research into the town's history, revealing that Millbrook had been established specifically to provide a cover story for the military operation that had lost track of the object in the first place. Rosa showed them soil samples she had collected from around the mine entrance, samples that contained elements that shouldn't exist in nature. Diane played recordings she had made of the sounds that sometimes echoed from the sealed mine on quiet nights, sounds that suggested the object was not as inactive as the military had hoped. Marcus realized that he hadn't just bought a ghost town. He had bought a government secret that someone was very eager to reclaim. The first direct contact came on his fourth night. Marcus was awakened by a soft knock on the hotel door, a sound so normal that it took him a moment to realize how wrong it was. No one knocked in a ghost town at 3 in the morning. He found a manila envelope slipped under the door, containing a single sheet of paper with a phone number and instructions to call at exactly 8 a.m. The message was brief but clear. They wanted to discuss his recent property purchase. Elena found him staring at the paper when she arrived with breakfast. Her face went pale when she read the message, and she immediately gathered the other women for what she called an emergency council. They met in the church, the only building in town with thick enough walls to potentially block electronic surveillance. Margaret paced the aisle between wooden pews that had heard more confessions than prayers in recent months. Sarah sketched nervous patterns in the dust that covered the floor. Rosa fingered a rosary while her eyes remained fixed on the windows. Diane consulted a notebook filled with contingency plans they had developed over months of preparation. Elena explained that they had been expecting this contact, but had hoped to have more time to prepare Marcus for what was coming. The phone number belonged to a private military contractor that specialized in recovering assets that the government preferred to forget. These weren't officials who would follow legal procedures or worry about constitutional rights. These were people who made problems disappear, and Marcus had become a problem the moment he signed the deed to Millbrook. At exactly 8 a.m., Marcus made the call from Henderson's old office while the 5 women listened on a speakerphone that Elena had rigged to the landline that somehow still worked despite the town's official abandonment. The voice on the other end was professional, polite, and absolutely terrifying in its casual discussion of Marcus's situation. The caller, who identified himself only as Mr. Davidson, explained that Marcus had unknowingly purchased property that contained classified materials. The government was prepared to compensate him generously for his cooperation in transferring ownership to a more appropriate entity. The compensation would be triple what Marcus had paid for the town, plus relocation assistance and a non-disclosure agreement that would ensure his comfortable retirement. The alternative, Mr. Davidson explained with the same pleasant tone, would be unfortunate for everyone involved. Marcus, following Elena's whispered coaching, asked for time to consider the offer. Davidson agreed to 24 hours, but made it clear that this was a one-time offer that would not be extended or improved. After the call ended, the silence in the mayor's office stretched until Rosa finally spoke in Spanish, words that needed no translation to convey their meaning. Margaret began talking about her contacts in Boston, people who might be able to help if they could get word to the outside world. Sarah wondered aloud if her art might serve as a form of documentation that could be smuggled out of town. Diane calculated their odds of survival if they chose to resist, numbers that were not encouraging. Elena pulled out a map of Nevada and began tracing routes that might take them beyond the reach of Davidson's people. But they all knew that running would only delay the inevitable. The decision to fight rather than flee came from an unexpected source. Rosa, who had spoken less than anyone during Marcus's first few days in town, revealed that she had been a paralegal in Phoenix before the fire that had destroyed her life. She understood legal processes, she understood government overreach, and she understood that people like Davidson counted on their targets being too frightened or too isolated to resist. She had spent months researching the legal status of Millbrook, diving into property records, mineral rights, and federal jurisdiction issues that might provide them with leverage. What she had discovered was that Henderson's death had created a legal vacuum that might work in their favor. The town's incorporation had never been officially dissolved, which meant it still existed as a municipal entity. As the property owner, Marcus could potentially claim mayoral authority, and the women could be appointed as town council members. If they could establish legitimate municipal governance, they might be able to invoke federal protections that would make Davidson's methods more difficult to implement. It was a long shot, but it was something more substantial than simply hoping for rescue or running blindly into the desert. Elena immediately began organizing their response, assigning roles and responsibilities with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment. Margaret would handle communications, using her contacts to alert sympathetic journalists and civil rights organizations. Sarah would document everything, creating a visual record that could serve as evidence or testimony. Diane would coordinate their security measures, implementing the surveillance countermeasures they had developed. Rosa would handle the legal paperwork, filing documents that would establish their municipal status before Davidson realized what they were attempting. The transformation of Marcus from unwitting victim to reluctant leader happened faster than any of them had expected. By the end of his first week in Millbrook, he had traded his designer clothes for practical work gear, and his Tesla for a beat-up pickup truck that Elena had kept running through mechanical skills learned from necessity. He threw himself into the role of mayor with the same intensity that had made him successful in the tech industry. But this time the stakes were measured in lives rather than stock prices. The women accepted his leadership with a mixture of surprise and relief, having grown accustomed to making decisions by consensus but recognizing the need for someone who could speak with legal authority. Marcus's first official act as mayor was to declare a state of emergency, a declaration that triggered a series of federal notifications and created a paper trail that would make Davidson's job significantly more complicated. His second act was to establish the Millbrook Historical Preservation Society, with all 5 women as founding members and board of directors. The society's mission was to protect and document the cultural significance of the town and its surroundings, a mission that would require extensive archaeological survey of the area around the mine. Elena smiled when Marcus announced the formation of the Historical Society, recognizing the strategic brilliance of using bureaucracy as a weapon against bureaucrats. If Davidson wanted to claim the mine and its contents, he would have to navigate federal environmental protection laws, archaeological preservation requirements, and historical designation processes that could tie up his operation for years. The women began working with renewed energy, transforming their survival strategies into a systematic campaign of legal and logistical resistance. Davidson's response to their municipal incorporation was swift and predictable. The harassment began with small things. Their mail delivery stopped, their internet service was mysteriously interrupted, and supply deliveries to the town were canceled due to security concerns. Then the pressure escalated. County officials who had ignored Millbrook for years suddenly discovered urgent code violations that required immediate attention. State environmental inspectors arrived to investigate reports of groundwater contamination. Federal agents appeared to conduct unspecified investigations related to national security matters. But Marcus and the women had prepared for this escalation, and each official visit was documented, recorded, and reported to the network of contacts that Margaret had assembled. Elena had prepared detailed responses to every inspection, producing documentation that Henderson had collected over years of dealing with government interference. Sarah's artistic background proved invaluable in creating detailed visual records of each interaction, sketches and photographs that captured subtle intimidation tactics that might not be apparent in written reports. Rosa's legal training allowed her to identify procedural violations and constitutional issues that could be challenged in court. Diane's research skills uncovered connections between the various officials and the private contractors that Davidson represented, connections that painted a picture of coordinated harassment rather than legitimate regulatory action. Margaret's communications network ensured that their story reached sympathetic journalists and advocacy organizations who could amplify their voices beyond the isolation of Millbrook. The town that had been forgotten by the world was suddenly receiving attention from sources that Davidson had not anticipated and could not easily control. The first breakthrough came when Sarah discovered the cave paintings. While documenting the geological features around the mine for the Historical Society, she noticed subtle markings on rock formations that had been dismissed by previous surveys as natural weathering. Her artist's eye recognized patterns and intentional design in what others had seen as random erosion. Using techniques she had learned in art school for examining faded frescoes, Sarah revealed images that predated any known human habitation of the area. The paintings depicted objects and symbols that matched Henderson's descriptions of what had been found in the mine chamber. Elena immediately understood the significance of Sarah's discovery. If they could prove that the mine contained archaeological artifacts of historical importance, federal protection laws would make it much more difficult for Davidson to gain access to the site. They would need professional archaeologists to authenticate the cave paintings and conduct a proper survey of the area. But that would require bringing outsiders to Millbrook, outsiders who might not be prepared for the dangers they would face. Marcus proposed a solution that demonstrated his growing understanding of their situation. Instead of bringing archaeologists to them, they would take evidence to the archaeologists. Sarah would create detailed reproductions of the cave paintings, complete with measurements and geological context. Rosa would research the legal requirements for archaeological protection and identify the specific agencies and procedures they would need to navigate. Margaret would identify academic institutions and researchers who might be interested in their discoveries and willing to support their cause. Diane would coordinate security measures to ensure that their evidence reached its intended recipients despite Davidson's surveillance and interference. The cave paintings were just the beginning of what Sarah found in the hills around Millbrook. As she extended her survey of the area, guided by Henderson's notes and her own intuition, she discovered a network of chambers and passages that had been carved into the rock by hands that had worked with tools more sophisticated than anything indigenous peoples of the region had possessed. The passages led toward the sealed mine, but they also extended in other directions, creating an underground complex that was far larger than anyone had realized. Elena joined Sarah's explorations, bringing the practical skills and local knowledge that years of survival in Millbrook had taught her. Together, They mapped the underground network, documenting chambers filled with more painted symbols and carved reliefs that told a story of contact between ancient peoples and something that had come from beyond their understanding. The story told in stone and pigment was not one of worship or fear, but of cooperation and exchange, as if the ancient peoples had worked alongside visitors who had brought knowledge and technology that had been carefully integrated into their culture. Marcus studied their findings with the analytical mind that had made him successful in technology, recognizing patterns and connections that suggested the underground complex had been designed as a kind of repository or archive. The symbols weren't random artistic expressions, but a systematic recording of information that had been preserved for future discovery. Rosa's legal research revealed that the cave complex extended beyond the boundaries of Marcus's property, crossing into federally protected wilderness areas that were subject to even stricter archaeological preservation laws. If they could prove the historical significance of the complete site, Davidson would face legal obstacles that might be insurmountable even for someone with his resources and connections. Davidson's next move revealed the desperation behind his professional demeanor. Rather than continuing the slow escalation of official harassment, he chose to make his presence known directly. A convoy of black SUVs arrived in Millbrook at dawn on a Tuesday morning, disgorging a dozen men in tactical gear who moved with military precision as they secured the town's perimeter. Davidson himself emerged from the lead vehicle, his expensive suit and polished shoes absurdly out of place in the dusty streets of the ghost town. He had come to make a final offer, he announced through a bullhorn that echoed off the empty buildings. Total cooperation in exchange for generous compensation and relocation assistance. Continued resistance would result in their immediate arrest on charges related to national security violations and terrorist activity. Marcus stepped out of the hotel to face Davidson directly, wearing the badge of office that Elena had crafted from Henderson's old mayoral insignia. Behind him, the 5 women emerged from their respective buildings, each carrying themselves with the dignity of people who had chosen their ground and were prepared to defend it. Elena held a folder containing copies of all the documents they had filed with various federal agencies. Sarah carried her portfolio of cave painting reproductions and geological surveys. Margaret had her communication equipment and contact lists. Rosa brought her legal briefs and constitutional challenges. Diane carried her documentation of Davidson's methods and connections. The confrontation that followed was captured by hidden cameras that Diane had installed throughout the town. Cameras that were broadcasting live to news organizations and advocacy groups that Margaret had contacted. Davidson found himself facing not just 5 desperate women and an eccentric tech millionaire, but a coordinated legal and media response that his previous targets had lacked the resources and knowledge to mount. The standoff lasted 3 days, during which Millbrook became the center of a national controversy about government overreach, corporate power, and the rights of small communities to resist forced relocation. Davidson's men maintained their perimeter around the town, but they could not prevent the arrival of journalists, lawyers, and supporters who demanded access to public officials conducting government business. The cave paintings became the focal point of the media coverage, with archaeologists from major universities weighing in on their potential significance and the need for proper scientific investigation. Environmental groups seized on the story as an example of how military and corporate interests threatened irreplaceable cultural resources. Civil liberties organizations highlighted the constitutional issues raised by Davidson's methods and the secretive nature of the government's claims. Marcus found himself thrust into the role of spokesperson for their cause, using his business experience to navigate media interviews and legal proceedings with an effectiveness that surprised everyone, including himself. Elena coordinated their daily operations with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for siege conditions, managing supplies, communications, and security with help from supporters who arrived despite Davidson's attempts to control access to the town. The 5 women who had lived in isolation for so long suddenly found themselves at the center of a movement that was much larger than their individual struggles. A movement that was using their story to address broader questions about government transparency and individual rights. The resolution came not through confrontation but through revelation. Diane's documentation of Davidson's operation had identified connections to defense contractors and government agencies that were deeper than anyone had realized. Her research revealed that the object in the mine was not just a classified military asset, but the center of a decades-long cover-up that involved multiple federal agencies and private corporations. The cover-up had been maintained not because the object was particularly dangerous, but because its discovery had revealed the existence of advanced technology that had been reverse-engineered and secretly developed into defense applications worth billions of dollars. The public revelation of these connections triggered congressional investigations and internal government reviews that made Davidson's mission politically untenable. Rather than risk further exposure of the classified programs connected to the Millbrook site, his superiors chose to abandon the operation and declare the mine area a protected archaeological site pending proper scientific investigation. Marcus's ownership of the town was confirmed through legal proceedings that established precedent for municipal rights in similar situations. Elena and the other women were officially appointed to a federal advisory committee overseeing the archaeological investigation of the cave complex. The town of Millbrook was designated as a research station and historical site, ensuring its protection and providing resources for its restoration and maintenance. Davidson and his team withdrew as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind no evidence of their presence except tire tracks in the desert dust and the memories of people who had chosen to stand rather than run. 6 months later, Millbrook had been transformed from a forgotten ghost town into a thriving research community. Marcus had invested his tech fortune into creating a state-of-the-art archaeological research facility, complete with laboratories, dormitories, and communication systems that connected the remote site to universities and research institutions around the world. Elena had become the town's first elected mayor, running unopened in an election that attracted national attention as a symbol of grassroots democracy and community resistance. Sarah's artwork had been exhibited in galleries across the country, with proceeds funding additional archaeological research and community development projects. Margaret had written a book about their experience that had become a bestseller and the basis for a documentary film that won several awards. Rosa had established a legal aid clinic specializing in cases involving government overreach and community rights, drawing on her experience in Millbrook to help other groups facing similar challenges. Diane had founded a research institute focused on investigating historical cover-ups and supporting whistleblowers and community activists. The 5 women who had been trapped in a dying town by circumstance and fear had become leaders in a national conversation about transparency, community rights, and the importance of preserving historical and cultural resources. The object in the mine remained sealed and classified, but the cave complex had been open to careful scientific investigation that was revealing new understanding of ancient cultures and their sophisticated knowledge systems. The story of Millbrook became more than just a tale of resistance and survival. It became a demonstration of how ordinary people could face extraordinary circumstances and emerge not just victorious, but transformed. Marcus had discovered that his greatest success would not be measured in stock prices or market share, but in his ability to use his resources and skills in service of something larger than personal gain. Elena had learned that leadership meant more than just survival, but the ability to inspire others to believe in possibilities they had never imagined. Sarah had found that her art could be a form of activism and documentation that preserved truth in ways that words alone could not achieve. Margaret had discovered that her gift for communication could build bridges between communities and causes that shared common struggles. Rosa had learned that the law could be a tool for justice when wielded by people who understood both its power and its limitations. Diane had found that research and documentation could expose truth and hold power accountable in ways that made lasting change possible. Together, they had proven that the combination of individual talents, shared purpose, and unwavering commitment could overcome forces that seemed insurmountable. The ghost town that had been forgotten by the world had become a symbol of hope for communities everywhere that faced displacement, exploitation, or abandonment by powerful interests that viewed them as obstacles rather than people deserving of dignity and respect.